All right, welcome. Following the tragic attack at Bondi Beach, a recent Valuetainment episode offered a pretty provocative analysis of what caused it and what it all means. So what we're going to do here is break down their specific interpretation, how they connect the dots from that horrible event to what they see as much, much wider problems for Western society. Okay, so right at the center of their whole argument is this really provocative statement, which comes from a clip they showed. This is the idea that pretty much shapes everything else they say. So let's walk through how they build their case step by step to support this claim. As you'd expect, they start their analysis with the events that kicked all of this off, the horrific attack in Australia. First, they lay out what they say are the key facts of what happened. So they kick things off by talking about the human cost. The hosts on the show report that the attack left 15 people dead. This really sets the stage for just how big of a tragedy they're talking about. And it wasn't just the fatalities. They also report that over 42 people had to be hospitalized. And they use this number to really underscore the widespread and, the indiscriminate nature of the violence. They also make a big point of emphasizing just how indiscriminate this attack was. They highlight how the victims spanned this huge age range from a 10-year-old kid all the way to an 87-year-old. And the point they're making is that this was an attack on everyday people, on civilians. Okay, so the source then lays out some really specific claims about the incident. They say the perpetrators were a father and son, who they call Islamist terrorists, and that they were targeting a family Hanukkah celebration. They also point to the attackers' training, their big arsenal of weapons, and what they call an abysmal police response and a major intelligence failure. So, once they've laid all that out, the speakers kind of pivot. They move from talking about what happened to what they say is the most important question, why it happened. And this is where they make a really crucial distinction. They argue that this attack wasn't just some random, isolated thing. Instead, they're framing it as a carefully planned act of terrorism that's rooted in a very specific ideology. And this quote right here really captures their frustration. They're basically saying, hey, these aren't just one-offs. They see it as a larger pattern, and it's a pattern that they think the West just isn't getting. Now, the speakers seem to know what people might say next, about violence in other religious books. They kind of brush off violence in the Old Testament, calling it war stories from a very specific time. And then they challenge people to find similar calls for violence against innocent people in the New Testament. And by doing this, they're basically framing this other ideology as something uniquely dangerous today. Okay, so this all leads them to what they say is a core weakness in the West, and they have a name for it: suicidal empathy. So what on earth do they mean by suicidal empathy? Well, according to them, it's empathy that's so extreme it actually becomes a weakness for a whole civilization. It's like a bug in the system that they say can be exploited by people who don't play by the same rules. And to back this idea up, they bring in a clip of Elon Musk, who they point to as saying that weaponized empathy is the fundamental weakness of the West. To really drive this point home, they talk about this video experiment they saw. You've got activists out there with refugees welcome signs. But then, when they're asked if they'd personally take in a refugee, most of them say no. And for the hosts, this is proof that a lot of this empathy is just for show, not something people are willing to act on. All right, so from here, their whole analysis builds up to their main point, which is that the values of the West and the ideology they're talking about just cannot exist together. They're fundamentally incompatible. And you can really see how they frame this conflict here. On one side, you've got Western values like tolerance and coexistence. And on the other side, they describe an ideology that's all about domination and the idea that there's only one truth, period. They really hammer this home with this quote. The message is clear. They're arguing these two ways of seeing the world are just completely different from each other. So, to back up this claim of incompatibility, they show a few different clips. There is an imam in Australia who they say was celebrating after October 7th, a man in Chicago saying Islam is the only truth, and a student in Texas making an argument about puberty defining adulthood. And for the hosts, each one of these clips is supposed to be a real-world example of these clashing, incompatible values in action. So, all of this brings us to their final section, which is basically a direct and pretty urgent warning to the West. And to really land their warning, they show this pretty powerful clip of a man they say is a Muslim who actually fled from ISIS. He's on their warning that if the West doesn't wake up, this is, in his words, just the beginning.
And by using his voice, it seems the source is trying to add weight to their warning, making it sound like it's coming from someone who's seen it firsthand.
Right after that, they show another clip. This time, it's the UAE's foreign minister. And they use it to show him warning that being too politically correct in Europe is going to lead to more extremists and terrorists down the road. And that brings us to their final bottom line argument. They say Western leaders have big hearts and small brains, and that their whole policy of tolerance is just inviting danger. They even allege there's a 3-step plan going on: migrate, multiply, and then dominate. And they warn that the very liberals they say are supporting these policies, they're still on the list to be targeted eventually. So the ultimate takeaway from their analysis is this really stark prediction. They're saying that if the West doesn't recognize and act on this clash of values, they will literally lose their countries. And this all leads to the final big question that the source seems to want its audience to think about. When you have two value systems that are presented as being completely incompatible, who's the one that's supposed to compromise?